This video will explain the story of Alan Wake's 1 and 2, as well as their DLCs, American Nightmare, and Control's AWE DLC. This video is also sponsored by Epic Games and Remedy Entertainment. Currently, there is a major sale going on for the game. The digital deluxe edition of Alan Wake 2 is 50% off on all platforms, Xbox, PlayStation, and the Epic Games Store. The new physical edition of the game even comes with Alan Wake 1 as a bonus. These sales should be live by the time this video is up, and will run to the 2nd or 3rd of December depending on the platform. So if you've never heard of Alan Wake or were interested in picking it up, now's the time to do it, especially now that all the DLCs are out. And once again, huge shout out to Remedy and Epic for sponsoring the video. With that out of the way, like the video if you enjoy, and subscribe if you're interested in story-related content like this. If you'd like to support the work I do, then feel free to donate to the Patreon for as little as $1 a month with the link in the description. And with that out of the way, let's get started. Alan Wake first begins in 2010 with our protagonist, Alan Wake, arriving in the town of Bright Falls with his wife, Alice. Alan Wake is a world-famous writer, most well known for his crime series Alex Casey. Alex Casey is a 6-part series that follows a detective of the same name through various crime scenes and investigations. His latest entry was The Sudden Stop, that ends with the death of Alex Casey. But this will be the last book Alan has published since, as for 2 years he can't seem to find the energy or motivation to write another. Being cooped up inside all day, doing nothing but staring at the wall and drinking coffee, Alice, Alan's wife, decided that a vacation was in order. So she and Alan take a trip to the small town of Bright Falls, Washington. Alan thinks this is just what he needs, a small break from work. Being in a new town, in a new home that also doesn't function as an office should ideally get him out of work mode. Unfortunately, being a best-selling author with books as well known as Alex Casey make it hard to relax when all you're reminded of is your work. The very first person Alan has stopped by, Pat Main, asks for an interview for the local radio, and the waitress of the Oh Dear Diner is an Alan Wake superfan. She even has a cardboard cutout of him right by the door. Hoping to not cause too much of a scene with his presence, he searches the diner to find Carl Stuckey, the man who has the keys to his new vacation home. He isn't here, however, as he had to call in sick, but a woman named Barbara is stepping in for him and gives Alan the key. Weirdly, Barbara claims that it's her cabin. Weirder still is that once Alan leaves, Carl comes rushing out of the diner with the keys to the cabin. This explains the initial confusion the two have, as the brochure says near the lake, not on it. So, whose house is he staying at? As they approach, Alan works on getting the lights on. Alice has a fear of the dark, so he wants to make sure the lights work before it gets dark. Once he turns on the generator, he goes upstairs to a surprise gift from Alice. It's a typewriter. The last thing he needs during his vacation. Alan blows up on her for it. He came here to relax, not work. He wanted this to be a complete reset, not just a different setting. Alice then confesses that the one reason she chose Bright Falls was because of Dr. Hartman. He's a psychiatrist who specializes in artists, writers, filmmakers, musicians, painters, you name it. He helps them find their creative edge again, and Alice believes he could help. Alan doesn't believe it. He thinks very little of the guy and questions why his wife would want him committed. It's clear from this conversation that the two's relationship isn't on good terms. Alan comments on a stump outside with some initials carved into it, saying that the island was the site of a love story, and that hopefully it can be again. Currently, it doesn't seem like it. Alan then storms out of the cabin to get some fresh air. As he does, the lights go out, which scares Alice. He rushes back to the cabin to help her, but she ends up being attacked by something and falls into the lake. After jumping in, he wakes up in his car, fresh off a crash. As he finds his bearings, he stumbles upon the big mystery of the game. What he finds is a manuscript page for a book titled Departure, the title of the book he was going to write after the vacation. But not only has it already been written, but he himself is the author. So Alan's managed to write an entire book, and yet does not know of him doing so. In episode 4, Alan gets a little drunk and passes out, during which he remembers exactly what happened here. See, during this moment at the cabin, Alan had dove into the lake to save Alice. Alice managed to swim her way out, but Alan didn't. That's because Cauldron Lake is a portal to another dimension. Remedy's other game, Control, explains that Cauldron Lake is an AWE or Altered World event that was caused by a threshold, which are locations that act as bridges between the real world and these dimensions. When he eventually came to, he was found by Barbara, who tricked him into entering the house, believing that Alice was still inside. Barbara tells it to him straight. Alice is dead. She drowned in the lake. But she has a way to get her back. He just needs to write her back into the story. See, Alan is not in the real world. He is in the other dimension called the Dark Place, which has the special power to take creative works and make them a reality. So if you were to hypothetically write a story while inside the Dark Place, then you can manifest that story into existence. Barbara, however, is lying. She wants Alan to write, but not to get Alice back, but so that she can escape. Before the Wake's arrival at Bright Falls, there was another couple that came here, Thomas Zane and Barbara Jagger. The two discovered the power of the lake, and along with their friend Emil Hartman tried to search for its power. He created a film called Tom the Poet, where Tom would be the main character, a diver called Tom the Poet. This gave Thomas a way to dive into the lake and explore it. Barbara had drowned during these expeditions, leaving Tom heartbroken. Dr. Hartman had encouraged Thomas to then write a piece that included her in the story. Remember, fictional works can become reality, so in theory, Thomas could just write her back to life. This failed, however, as a balance needs to be struck. One must giveth before they can taketh. The dark place had taken Barbara, but to get her back, someone must replace her. Otherwise, there is an empty seat. As a result, the dark presence, an entity that resides within the dark place, took over her body and controlled it. Thomas had realized that he had just unleashed a horrific kind of evil into the world, so he wrote himself out of existence so that things could go back to normal. As the two's bodies descended deeper into the lake, the bright presence, antagonist to the dark presence, took over Tom's body, and now the two forces are at an interlocking war. Well, now the dark presence is back and preying on Alan, still wearing Barbara's face. The dark presence has Barbara is trying to get Alan to write it back into the real world so that it can escape the confines of the dark place and achieve whatever otherworldly goal it has in mind. Just like with Thomas, the dark presence is going to use Alan's skill as a writer to do it. It wants him to create a story that will release it. Alan is writing the story under the guise that he's saving Alice, when it's actually to release the dark presence. Alan, after days of writing this story, catches on to the ruse, but rewriting the story is going to be harder than it seems. See, despite using the power of creative works, these works need to follow a set of rules. The first is that you can't spawn things into existence. You can't create new things within the dark place, only manipulate current things. This is a little further ahead in the timeline, but Alan in the sequel will run into the detective Alex Casey. You'd think this is the Alex Casey from his detective series, but it's not. This is a real detective who happens to be named Alex Casey. He is not a fictional character turned real. This Alex Casey has always existed. The dark place cannot create new things from whole cloth. They have to already exist. So if he needs something like, say, a bridge, he can't just say that a bridge spawned out of nowhere. What he can say, though, is that nearby debris created a walkable path that would get him across. The second and most important rule is that it needs to flow. Alan Wake cannot create some kind of MacGuffin out of thin air, and he can't rewrite the story to say that he escaped the dark place with Alice and everyone lived. The end. That's a terrible ending, and a terrible story, thus it won't work. The story must flow in a natural direction. It needs to have stakes, drama. The genre of this story is horror, so he needs to make a story where the protagonist might not survive, otherwise the horror is lost. What's been written is also permanent. You can't start from scratch. You can alter some of the text, as we'll see in the sequel, but it still needs to flow naturally within the story. Alan had written days worth of a plot that would help the dark presence escape, so now he has to continue the story from where he left off, make it flow well, and, hopefully, craft it well enough so that Alan and Alice escape, and the dark presence stays in the dark place. Sounds like a tough task, but he's not called the best-selling author for no reason. The story he's writing is called Departure, the same as the manuscript he's picking up. Essentially, Alan is writing a story where he is the protagonist. So keep in mind, everything from the car crash onwards was written by Alan while he was in the dark place. That's why the manuscript pages we pick up describe events that will happen or have already happened. A park ranger named Rusty will be attacked and then tell Alan that it happened, just like it was on that page, which are the exact words the manuscript uses. To return to our timeline, Alan is locked within the dark place writing the story for the dark presence. After realizing he'd been tricked, he wrote Thomas Zane back into the story as his diver character Tom the Poet. Alan had found papers and drafts of Thomas here in the dark place back when Thomas first came here, so he used these to help recreate his Tom the Poet character. He then used this moment of clarity to escape the house and drive away from the dark presence. But that's when he would crash, which brings us right to where we left off. Alan's story of Departure tells the tale of Alan Wake's escape. But what's a story without drama and stakes? So Alan won't be walking around the town by himself. He'll have to come face to face with the forces of darkness. Taken are beings that have supposedly been fully possessed by the dark presence. As the power of the dark presence grows, the stronger its hold over the people becomes, which is why it's amassed such an army. However, Alan fights something close to a few hundred of these Taken throughout the game, and yet according to Control, it seems only a couple of people went missing after this game concludes. So it's possible that these were people the dark presence had possessed over the years. Eventually, he'll make his way to a gas station where he's found by Sarah Breaker, the sheriff of Bright Falls. She takes him back to the cabin on the lake, only to find that there is no cabin on the lake. There hasn't been one since the 70s, back when Thomas Zane still lived there. He is then taken to the town and gets checked out by the local doctor. After he's checked out, he gets a call from an unknown caller claiming to have his wife. Alan decides to go investigate this alone, as there is no way he could explain what happened last night without getting arrested. The caller on the phone wants to meet at Lover's Peak at midnight. He also left him a surprise just outside the sheriff's office to let him know he meant business. That gift is Alice's driver's license, along with a manuscript page detailing their meeting at Lover's Peak. So not only does this person have Alice and is a part of the story, but they know they're in the story. As he returns, he meets with Dr. Hartman, the one who convinced Alice that Alan needs to see a shrink. We then meet with Barry Wheeler, Agent 2 Alan Wake, who has arrived just in time to get him out of here. Now that he's alone, he could tell Barry everything that happened and then focus on finding Alice. Barry didn't believe most of it, still thinking like his agent, only seeing the amount of green they could make from a story like this. But he did believe that Alice was kidnapped. Alan then sets off to Lover's Peak to meet this kidnapper at midnight. As he walks the trail, he meets with Park Ranger Rusty, who is attacked by something, leaving him gravely wounded. Alan goes to turn the lights on but is attacked by Rusty, who has become a Taken. Shortly after this, Alan will fall from a gondola, causing him to lose the gun. Someone nearby comes to assist him, except it's the kidnapper. Without a gun, Alan is forced to work with him so they can both escape the Taken, who have them surrounded. When they're safe, Ben reveals that he's only doing this for the manuscript. He wants to know what's going to happen to him in the future so that he can plan for it. Alan only cares about his wife, so he punches him, causing them both to fall and split up. The fall caused the gun to drop near him, which prompts Ben to book it before he fires off a shot. With the kidnapper gone, Alan returns to Barry to ask if he could pull together any info he finds on Ben. During a search, Barry gets a call from Rose, who says that she has more manuscript pages, and that they're at her place, at a trailer park just outside town. These could hopefully give Alan more insight into what's going on, or at minimum, learn what comes next, so it's a fine lead. But as the episode ends, we see that Rose is being manipulated by the Dark Presence. Alan and Barry arrive before getting a call from Sheriff Breaker, saying that an agent from the FBI is here to see them. That will have to be put on hold for now, as this meeting with Rose is more important. As the two sit down for coffee, they realize their drinks are spiked, and they pass out. The Dark Presence, still using the body of Barbara, had come to visit her, and preyed on her undying love for Alan Wake, telling her that she could be his muse if she helped, which is when she went under its spell. A few hours pass, and as the boys come to, they awake to police sirens. Randolph, the guy who guided them to her house, called the sheriff's office, as he was worried the two men had done something to her, as they had been there for a few hours. Arriving on scene is the FBI agent who wants to see him, Agent Nightingale. According to some of the external media and manuscripts, Nightingale was partners with another agent named Finn. Finn, however, seems to have been affected by the Dark Presence in some way, as he was becoming more averse to shadows and darkness. At some point, he was taken by the darkness and never seen again. Saddened at the loss of his friend, Nightingale drank heavily in the following days and continues to do so even today. Eventually, he would start having these nightmares of Alan Wake. These nightmares seem to have drawn Agent Nightingale to Bright Falls, as a manuscript page mentions how he had to catch the writer, no matter the cost. Similar to his talk with the sheriff, Alan trying to explain anything of what happened would likely put him in jail, so it's best to just run and hope he doesn't get caught. Alan then makes a daring escape out of the trailer park. He is caught once more by the agent when he arrives at the local radio station, but is able to escape once again. As night turns to day, he heads to the nearby coal mine to meet with the kidnapper, in hopes of finding Alice, but the kidnapper is nowhere to be found. He gets a call from Ben, who tells him there's a change in the plans, and to now head to Mirror Peak. Upon arriving, Ben is seen on his knees, seemingly in shock over something. Dialogue from him tells us that he doesn't have Alice. He never did in the first place. Ben is taken by the Dark Presence, who also launches Alan off the pier and into the lake. As he comes to, he's greeted by Dr. Hartman again, who takes him back to his lodge. Despite seeming like a normal psychiatrist, Dr. Hartman has some nefarious intentions. The reason he became a specialist and artist is because he's trying to use their work to influence the Dark Place and reap the benefits of it. Dr. Hartman isn't a creator, just a doctor, and after seeing what happens to those with creative minds, those artists that would become his patients, he preferred to stay away from it all. But what he couldn't stay away from was the power of the lake. Ever since he and Thomas Zane discovered its power, he wanted it all to himself. So he's assumed the role of producer, guiding and helping creatives along their path to recovery, while attempting to keep the power of the lake to himself. Just about every patient of his at the lodge is one of his victims, but he hasn't seen nearly as much success with them as he did with Thomas Zane. Thankfully, a world-famous writer had just arrived in town. He was in talks with Alice Wake about how to help Alan, but it's clear he only wanted him for his writing expertise. He had hired an assistant to get Alan to come to the lodge, that being Ben Mott, the kidnapper. Ben Mott has low self-esteem, and always looked for approval from Dr. Hartman. He would use this to his advantage by having Ben stalk the couple, which you can see in the opening ferry ride. Dr. Hartman would then tell Ben to call Alan, claiming he has his wife, when he's clearly bluffing. All's well that ends well, as they say, as even if the method was sloppy, he managed to get Alan into his custody. Alan was also drugged by him to make this process easier, so that Hartman's words sound more believable as they leave his lips. Alan is then introduced to some of the patients here at the lodge, the most notable of which are the Anderson brothers, Tor and Odin. Both of them were a part of a band in the 70s called the Old Gods of Asgard, but have recently suffered from dementia. As we'll discover, the Anderson brothers come from a long line of seers, who could see the truth in things when other people can't. Multiple notes from both games confirm that they did battle with the Dark Presence just like Thomas Zane. Now keep in mind they are just musicians, so I don't think they physically fought the entity, they likely used the power of music somehow. Their skills as musicians had helped them fend it off and keep it locked within the Dark Place, but Odin had lost an eye during the battle. The two brothers tell Alan to go to their farm, because they have a secret for him that they wrote down. Alan then packs it in for the night, trying to wrap his head around what happened and what to do next. Meanwhile, downstairs, the brothers cause a commotion, which gives Alan a chance to escape the lodge. As he makes his way to Hartman's office, he finds Barry. He was called by Dr. Hartman after he woke up from their meeting with Rose, and was told to come here since Alan had just arrived. But once Barry stepped inside, two bodyguards knocked him out and locked him in the room. Hartman goes back to his office only to meet a gun to his face. A distraction from the Dark Presence gives Alan enough time to escape, while also trapping Hartman to be taken by its presence. Alan and Barry then escape the lodge, only for Alan to instruct Barry to go to the Anderson farm, much to his disapproval. Some falling rocks cause the car to swerve and crash on the side of the road. Both men are okay, but they are split up and need to regroup at the Anderson farm. As they both arrive, they are surrounded by Taken, so they need to put on a concert and use the stage props as a light to fend off the darkness. If you think that's a crazy turn of events, consider this isn't the last time a concert is performed in this series. Once that's done, they make it to the farmhouse and find a song that talks about finding the Lady of the Light, as she will help reshape his destiny. This Lady of the Light is Cynthia Weaver, the woman we saw back in episode 1 when we first entered the diner. Before they meet with Cynthia, they decide to call it a night. They don't want to run into any more Taken on the way, so they wait till morning to find her. In the meantime, the two guys get drunk off the Andersons' moonshine. This is when Alan learns the truth about the manuscripts, about the Dark Place, and everything we've discussed earlier. For some odd reason, the moonshine gave Alan the clarity he needed, opening his mind to all that was once forgotten. The moonshine was made from unfiltered water straight from Cauldron Lake, so its supernatural properties have something to do with this. As he awakes, having learned what happened, he's greeted by Agent Nightingale, who managed to track him down and arrest him. He talks with both him and Sheriff Breaker about what happened. After arresting the two, Agent Nightingale had found a stack of manuscript papers, some with his name on it, confirming to him that Alan was the cause of his nightmares. Nightingale then pulls a gun on Alan before realizing that what he just did was written down in the manuscript page he found, leading him to be taken by the Dark Presence. Barry, Alan, and Sheriff Breaker then have to make their way through the town without getting killed by the Dark Presence, who seems to be getting stronger by the minute. They manage to find a working helicopter and fly to the town's power plant, which is where Cynthia is located. Cynthia Weaver is a friend of Thomas Zane, although she wanted them to be more than just friends. Eventually, Barbara would drown in the lake, which is when he would write himself out of existence. But he also wanted Cynthia to be the Lady of the Light, a person who would protect the town from the Dark Presence. That's why she's so obsessed with light and dislikes the darkness. She's been keeping the town safe since the 70s. She was also the one who made the symbols that can only be revealed with light, and was the one who stashed all the ammo, batteries, and guns throughout the town. Thomas had wanted to make sure Alan was prepared when he arrived. Cynthia then took refuge in the power plant, because it was there where she built the well-lit room. In the room is a shoebox, and inside is a clicker from a lamp, and a manuscript page that details Alan arriving here in the well-lit room and picking up the clicker. It's through some conversation and dialogue that we learn that Thomas Zane made Alan come here. Thomas Zane had written in one of his stories that a character known as Alan Wake was scared of the dark, so his mom gave him a clicker that he could flip on to scare away the darkness. He then created a story that involved Alan Wake coming here and using the clicker to defeat the darkness. He made sure to write a loophole in the story that says that whatever is inside the shoebox stays. This would allow him to transfer these items to Alan Wake while Thomas writes himself out of existence. Now remember, you cannot create things out of thin air, so Alan Wake already existed. Thomas had just moved a few things around in his life so that he could get him here. How much of Alan is the real Alan, though? That's hard to say. Did he always aspire to be a writer, or was that Thomas Zane's writing? How much of this story is Thomas's? How much of it is Alan's? Also hard to say. I think that Thomas Zane had made the introduction, so to speak. He got Alan here to Bright Falls. The rest, everything we've gone through, was done by Alan. But with this knowledge in hand, Alan knows what to do. Go back to Cauldron Lake, find Barbara, and use the clicker to end this nightmare once and for all. As he approaches the cabin, he grabs the clicker, takes a deep breath, and jumps into the lake. Alan is then taken into some dream of him and Alice in their apartment in New York. He's able to see through the illusion though and escape. He then talks to the Bright Presence, who shows him Mr. Scratch, saying that his friends will meet him when he's gone. Scratch is essentially evil Alan Wake. Alan is going to end up in the dark place a little longer than he hopes. While that happens, Scratch is going to replace Alan. As I said before, you must give and take in equal amounts. Unlike Thomas, who tried to free Barbara without giving something up in return. Alan will have to trade places with Alice. Scratch was then created by the Dark Presence as an identical twin of Alan Wake. We'll see him a bit more in the spin-off title though. For now, Alan pushes through the dark place and confronts the Dark Presence, still holding Barbara's body hostage. He then takes the clicker, puts it in the hole in her chest, and switches it on, releasing its control over Barbara. Alan then sits down and writes the last page of Departure. He was in the middle of writing it when the Bright Presence came by to help him, so he hadn't finished the story yet. Sitting down, he writes that he sacrificed his life for Alice. Alice then goes free and escapes the dark place, which is what we saw in the cutscene back in episode 1, while Alan stays trapped in here. There must be a balance in the world, cause and effect, guilt and atonement. Alan comes in, and Alice goes out. As the game winds to a close, the town can be seen celebrating Deerfest, a local town custom, as we see Agent Nightingale eerily watching over Rose, who has now become the new Lady of the Light. Now trapped in the dark place, it's on Alan to find his own way out. This then brings us to the 2 special feature DLCs. These DLC episodes will play out in Alan Wake's head. Now that Alan is properly trapped inside the dark place, his mind is going crazy. He's struggling to focus and contain his thoughts. The power of the dark place wants to keep him suspended for eternity, but Alan won't let that happen. So everything we play through during the DLCs are visual representations of his mind. That means the antagonist of the DLC is Mr. Alan Wake himself. Throughout the DLC, Alan will come across another Alan on a TV. This is one part of Alan Wake's mind. We play as the other. The Alan in the TV represents the part of him that wants to give up and surrender to the dark place and its power. We play as the other part of his mind, the one that wants to escape, the one who will write his way out of this nightmare no matter how many drafts it takes. So our objective is to fight back against TV Alan, which in real life would mean that we help Alan wrestle with his thoughts. That's why when Alan is given a flashlight, it's stated that it's not the light itself, but what it represents. The flashlight represents a light in the darkness, a light and unclouded part of his mind, safe from all the dark, sinister thoughts. The gun then is not a gun, but a tool of elimination, a tool to defeat those dark thoughts and clear his mind. As you'd expect though, the mind of a best-selling author is complex and horrifying. The town is misshapen, and reality is twisting and bending to his mind, all while TV Alan is harassing him, making him feel lesser about himself. As the game puts it, it feels like TV Alan is a demented storyteller who is out to destroy the protagonist, which is himself. He'll then come across Barry at one point, but it's not the real Barry, of course. It's what he thinks of Barry manifested into a real being. These conversations illuminate Alan's thoughts on Barry, revealing that while he does find him annoying at times, he is always glad that he's around to help him pull him out of trouble. There's even a moment where we get to see Alan's thoughts on Alice. He has a conversation with Dr. Hartman. Again, not the real one. Hartman tells Alan that he's had a history of issues that Alice has had to suffer through. Further questioning if trading places with her was the smart thing to do. It then cuts to a recording of Alice berating Alan for what he did, wishing that she never sees him again. Obviously, this isn't Alice. It's the dark side of Alan's mind assuming that Alice would be mad at him over what happened. But both this game and the sequel will show that she has nothing but love for him. Hatred was never even in the conversation, and our Alan knows this. This conversation then leads us back to the cabin. He then has to fight off the dark manifestations of his friends and colleagues that he's met during the game. After fighting back his dark thoughts, his mind is cleared up for the first time. Alan Wake has managed to gain some semblance of control over the dark place. With a clear vision and an even clearer mind, he starts writing his next book. If Departure was made to swap places with Alice, then the next book is going to be the title that gets him out, so it's only fair that it's called Return. Alan Wake's American Nightmare, a spin-off sequel of sorts, was released a few years after the first game and takes place right after the special feature DLCs. American Nightmare is meant to be one of the many drafts he'll come to write for Return. The setting of this book is meant to be a twist on a Night Springs episode. Night Springs is supposed to be an in-game version of the Twilight Zone. Alan Wake used to work for Night Springs, so this setting we find ourselves in was an early draft of an episode he was writing for the program. The antagonist this time around is Mr. Scratch, which we saw at the end of the base game. As mentioned before, Mr. Scratch is like evil Alan Wake. He embodies a lot of his unflattering desires and characteristics, even embodying the rumors that were spread about him, such as one that claimed he was a serial killer who killed his wife, something that spread after he fell into the dark place. This can easily be seen in brief scenes we have of Scratch where he is seen killing people, partying, and generally having a grand old time, not caring at all about what people think about him. While this happens, Alan is able to also peer into the outside world to see what's going on, as he learns that Barry is now managing the old gods of Asgard, and even gets them to record new music, while Barry and Alice discuss what to do with Alan's stuff now that he's gone. We'll see some more of this in the sequel, but there seems to be some kind of unique power of his, where he's able to peer into the outside world despite being trapped in the dark place. How he manifested this power is unclear, but it's how he's able to learn about this knowledge, and also how he gets his material for his new stories. Alan then tries to devise a plan using the setting to defeat Scratch and escape, but that doesn't happen as easily as he'd like. Scratch knows that Alan is trying to escape, so every time he comes close, he sends him right back to the beginning. Alan is stuck in a loop, so to escape he needs to change things about the scene, and over time slightly alter his original plan to stop Scratch. The initial plan involves him following in the footsteps of Scratch until making it to the drive-in theater. He then goes inside the projector room and then matches what the manuscript says, which is to turn the time to 2:36 a.m. and flip the calendar to August. This doesn't work. Scratch catches on, and Alan is sent back to the beginning of the loop. The rest of the game is spent trying to alter this loop and trying to find the correct combination. This all ends with Alan activating the film reel, which plays a video of him and Alice embracing one another, as Scratch is defeated. At the time, this could have been considered canon, but as future titles will show, this was not real. Alan didn't truly escape the dark place, he's still very much stuck in there, and there's a big reason why. I've talked about this a few times in previous videos, but Alan Wake's journey mimics much of the hero's journey. The hero's journey is a literary device that usually starts with the protagonist going on some kind of adventure, dealing with the hardships and struggle, and then returning home changed from their adventure. This pattern of storytelling was popularized by writer Joseph Campbell. According to him, there are 17 steps in the hero's journey, but they can be divided into 3 acts: departure, initiation, and return. Make sense now? Notice how Alan's recent draft was for return. He's completely skipped initiation. He hasn't put himself through the hero's journey, that's why his attempt had failed. Just like the rules of the dark place, he needs to make it flow. You can't just skip a whole act to get right to the good part, so despite resulting in more attempts on his life, Alan will have to brave things once more and go through that initiation. Except, he didn't figure that out just yet, as initiation's draft begins during Alan Wake 2. In between then are a few more failed attempts he made to try to write his escape. This takes us to Remedy's other title, Control. In case you might not be aware, Remedy's titles are part of a connected universe. The 2 franchises currently confirmed in the universe are Control and Alan Wake. Control is its own story, but it does intertwine with Alan Wake's, especially as we get deeper into the sequel. The connection they share as of right now is Control's second DLC, AWE, where Alan plays a lead role. For some background, Control stars protagonist Jesse Faden, who is guided by Polaris, this entity in her head, to a place called the Oldest House. This facility is the headquarters of the FBC, or the Federal Bureau of Control. The FBC is best described as Remedy's take on the SCP Foundation. All manner of weird paranatural phenomenon end up here. Things like a refrigerator that moves when no one is looking. These items are called altered items, and are called as such because they're connected to altered world events. To relate this to Alan Wake, what occurred at Bright Falls is considered an altered world event, and the manuscript pages would be altered items due to their reality-changing properties. I'll delve deeper into Control in a future video, one that will likely discuss the Remedy connected universe as a whole. But for the purposes of Alan Wake, Jessie very early on becomes the director of the FBC, and does her best to take back the Oldest House from an entity known as the Hiss. After the main campaign is over, she heads over to a newly discovered wing of the Oldest House to reduce the corruption. During this, she finds an apparition of Alan Wake meeting with Thomas Zane. He comments on how he looks different. Tom will clarify what we already talked about. The diver, Tom the Poet, was a character he played in his old film. This is supposedly the real Thomas Zane this time. Jessie then continues investigating the sector while also catching her up to speed on the AWE that occurred in Bright Falls. The DLC plays into that Alan Wake style of storytelling, by having Alan periodically narrate events that are about to happen, just like the manuscript pages would tell us in the first game, hinting that Alan may have some control over some of these events. From the collectibles found throughout the game, we learn that Alice, after the events of the first game, had been seeing nightly visions of Alan. Who she's referring to is Mr. Scratch, who is trying to torment her. It was also reported that Dr. Hartman survived his encounter with the Dark Presence back at the Lodge, as the FBC had found him and placed him under arrest. However, interviews conducted soon after deemed him no longer to be a threat, so they let him go. Dr. Hartman was still obsessed with the lake and its power though, so he willingly jumped into Cauldron Lake, becoming malformed and infected by the darkness. This entity that is causing a ruckus in the investigation section is Dr. Hartman, who Jessie will have to put down towards the end of the DLC. And Agent Kieran Estevez, who's been the working lead agent for the Bright Falls AWE, was the one who brought Dr. Hartman in, after discovering that he had become a Taken. Once brought in, this is when the Bureau would learn about the Taken and how they're resistant to damage when covered in darkness. They'd attempted to rebuild a replica of the lodge that Hartman had stayed in to see if his behavior would change, but that didn't seem to work. Hartman would go mad, however, when Alice Wake was brought to the FBC for questioning, as her presence may have set him off. Once Jesse defeats Hartman, a member of the Bureau, Langston, tells Jesse of an incoming alert. Another AWE was reported in Bright Falls, but the date says that it's a few years in the future, which leads us to Alan Wake 2. Alan Wake 2 picks up in 2023, 13 years later, and Alan is still stuck in the dark place. Alan Wake 2's structure is confusing, making it hard to discuss in a video like this. As I mentioned before, Alan needs to write Initiation before Return. Well, both books are written in this game. Alan's campaign is Initiation, and the new protagonist Saga Anderson's campaign is Return. The thing is, both campaigns happen at the same time, and the player is even allowed to go back and forth between each one at will. So while it may seem better to just go in order of the books, let's briefly set the scene by going over the intros first. The very beginning starts with Saga Anderson, an FBI agent working with her partner Alex Casey on a case in Bright Falls. They got a report of a murder deep in the woods, another in a long series of murders that have taken place here. We play out this murder during the intro, where Robert Nightingale is seen emerging from Cauldron Lake before being killed by this cult, calling themselves the Cult of the Tree. They seem to be performing a ritual on him, but they had to cut it short as two people walking in the woods spotted the cult mid-act. Saga then meets with deputies Thornton and Mulligan to discuss the details, which leads her to believe that the previous murders and this murder are connected. During the investigation, she will find a manuscript page addressed to her and Casey, the first sign of Alan Wake's new book, Return. As the two take the body back to the morgue, they discover another page in his chest, but all of a sudden, Nightingale gets up. He wasn't dead as the characters had thought. So now Saga has to chase him down to the forest again. To do this, she goes through an overlap. The dark place and the real world overlap here, as it's influenced by the similar stories that take place in these locations. Here in the forest world is the Witch's Ladle, which tells the story of a ghost who killed the sheriff by ripping their heart out. And as we just saw, Nightingale, while not a sheriff, is a man of law, who also had his heart ripped out. The similarities in both the story and location manifested the overlap, and this structure is also applied to the other overlaps we'll soon enter. Here she will face and kill Nightingale, ending this brief nightmare. As a result, the water clears up, and out pops Alan Wake. Alan's campaign picks up right after this and shows us how this happened. Alan is still stuck in the writer's room, but by using the writer's room he can project himself into the dark place, allowing him to explore by going deeper and deeper until he eventually finds a way out. This projection is based on his initial draft of Initiation. He finds himself in a fictionalized New York City. He starts to see echoes of Alex Casey working on a case based on numerous killings from a cult. He'll even find himself talking to Alex Casey at times during his journey. He uses this as inspiration for the draft of Initiation. Towards the end of the chapter, he comes across the crime scene of Nightingale. He touches the heart and then has a conversation with Saga Anderson. Afterward, Parliament Tower, the place where Alan and Alice stayed in New York, appears. He then takes the elevator to the room before coming across an exhibit made by his wife. After this, he finally enters the writer's room. He sees the draft for Return on the desk. Just like before, he doesn't remember writing it. That's before Scratch comes in and kills him, resetting the loop and taking him back to the writer's room again. Okay, so where does this scene on the shore come in? Well, not until the very end, and not in the way you'd expect either. That's the trouble when discussing this game. Things are happening and not happening at the same time. We could look at Alan's conversation with Saga as an example. Alan, in the dark place, finds Nightingale's murder site and his heart. Touching his heart makes it disappear, only for Saga to find it in a freezer back in Bright Falls. She will then use this heart to open the overlap, which will let her defeat Nightingale. After both of these interactions, they can communicate with each other through the overlap in the dark place. The thing is, this is not happening at the same time. Alan's conversation with Saga happens right after the heart disappears, but Saga starts after killing Nightingale, a whole 15 minutes after getting the heart. This also happens twice more. Like Nightingale, Saga will have to take down a few more entities during her campaign. The two deputies, Thornton and Mulligan, and Cynthia Weaver. Similar to before, Alan will assist her with this. He will touch a deer mask, which Saga needs for a float, and then he'll touch a vinyl record, which Saga needs for a jukebox. Not only are these out of order though, this shouldn't be happening. Saga's campaign goes Nightingale, the deputies, then Cynthia Weaver. Alan's is Nightingale, Cynthia Weaver, then the deputies. Further, if these were in order, Saga shouldn't be talking to Alan in this overlap, because in her campaign he's back at the lodge with Alex Casey, not in the dark place. Basically, Alan is seeing a glimpse of the future, while Saga is seeing glimpses of the past, With me so far? Great. To make this a bit easier, let's talk about Alan's campaign first, as Initiation is the second book in our trilogy. So after Alan gets killed and ends up back in the writer's room, he realizes that he needs to make another, better draft of Initiation. Like before, he's going to use the same plot structure. A murder cult is on the loose here in New York City, and Alex Casey was on the case. Alan assumes these weird visions he's having are echoes of inspiration, cut ideas from his time when writing the Alex Casey books, but that might not be true. These are real events. Sort of. Alex Casey mentions this cult, the Cult of the Word, to Saga. This was a real case he investigated. An FBC report also confirms the existence of the Cult of the Word. Alan will also directly say at the end of the game that what he thought was inspiration was actually real events. So Alex Casey did investigate this Cult of the Word. These echoes we are seeing are glimpses into that time. Now, some may argue that this is just Alan rewriting the story, so Casey only believes he investigated the cult. And you know what? Fair point. During Saga's campaign, it becomes clear that Return is changing her reality. The story of the third book, Return, claimed that she and her husband divorced and that her daughter Logan had died via drowning. In reality, this never happened. Logan is alive and well at their home back in Virginia. But over time, Casey starts to believe the fake story. At the beginning, he talks about Logan, only to then tell Saga that Logan had died at the end of the game. That's because at the beginning of the game, he isn't affected by the story just yet, so we could believe his word. So I believe that anything Casey says early on is the truth, and it's around this time where he starts talking about the cult. To clear up some confusion about Casey, though, Alex Casey in Saga's campaign is real. Alex Casey in these echoes are real, just past events Alan is peering into. And Alex Casey in the Dark Place is fictional, likely based on the Alex Casey from his stories. So Casey in Saga's campaign didn't magically appear in the Dark Place with Alan. This is the fictional Alex Casey, the detective from his books. At the very beginning of these loops, Alan is interviewed by talk show host Warland Dorr. He briefly describes the premise of the book. It's a story about a fictional writer named Alan Wake who's trapped in a nightmare, desperately trying to find the manuscript page he's forgotten he's wrote. He's tormented by his evil doppelganger Mr. Scratch, and is guided by the visions of a fictional detective he's written about, Alex Casey. The book is autofiction, which is when an author uses a story to recount their life in third person. Just like with Departure, it's a story written by Alan Wake, wherein Alan Wake plays himself. Initiation was created using the glimpses of real Alex Casey's investigation into the Cult of the Word, with a bit of imagination and creativity likely sprinkled in there for good measure. I say that because some of the characters are clearly references to characters in Saga's campaign. The two cops who dump bodies for the cult in Alan's campaign are Thornton and Mulligan, people Saga will also run into. The game doesn't suggest though that they went to New York to help the cult, then came to Bright Falls. Similarly, the ones who spotted the killing of Nightingale in the intro were Ed and Tammy Booker. But they were also witnesses to the crimes committed by the Cult of the Word here in Alan's campaign. Alan seems to be using some creative liberties here, as the echoes only give him glimpses of the investigation. He has to fill in the rest as he goes. As for who this cult is, their story goes that they were recreating murders from the Alex Casey book series. They saw Alan Wake as their prophet, and the Alex Casey books as their Bible. Alex Casey, the real FBI detective, then decided to look into the cult because he started getting notes in the mail from them. Alan then uses these cult killings as inspiration for Initiation. The first draft began with the cult torching a train of passengers, again to recreate the scenes from the Alex Casey books. Their goal was to eventually release Alan from the confines of the Dark Place so that he may escape. Again, there are certainly some creative liberties being taken here, as I can't imagine the cult knew of the Dark Place. This part was likely added in by Alan so that he could escape somehow. But this draft of Initiation didn't work as seen earlier, so he needs to go deeper. Find something dangerous, something more horrific for the Dark Place to latch onto. That's when he gets a call from a mysterious stranger. They want him to meet them at the Ocean View Hotel. Located here in the hotel is none other than Thomas Zane. You'll notice they look eerily similar. The nature of why isn't fully understood, but Remedy likes to use lots of parallels in their story. Thomas Zane and Alan are both creatives. Both look the same. Both dealt with the Dark Place, both went into the Dark Place to save their wives. Both of them also have a Lady of the Light, Cynthia Weaver and Rose, both of whom were also obsessed with their respective creatives. They are not the same person, but they are the same in many ways. Thomas then greets Alan as he's excited to get back to work on their collaboration. His film, Nightless Night, and Alan's Return were going to work as collaborative pieces that would see them both released from the Dark Place. However, Alan doesn't remember writing it, except this time he's actually telling the truth. A later meeting will confirm that Scratch was actually the one who met with Thomas. Scratch worked with Thomas Zane to escape, but Scratch betrayed Thomas and took Return with him, which explains why he's still stuck in the Dark Place. Alan was so deep in the dark place that, like the DLC, he started to lose his mind. He even stopped writing at one point, claiming that they didn't deserve to get out. Scratch promised Thomas Zane that they would, and his art was magnificent. It was exactly what they needed. So that's why he chose to work with Scratch over Alan. Armed with enough knowledge, though, he was ready to start the second draft of Initiation. This time, the murder took place in a hotel. It was an interactive experience. The audience and the hotel itself were meant to be a part of the play. It went wrong when the play about a murder cult was infiltrated by an actual murder cult. The main murder victim was a woman who played the muse of the writer. The writer was the devil, a mysterious guy who never broke character. The muse, as we learn, is Cynthia Weaver. Again, I don't believe Cynthia to be the actual muse of the play, likely some more creative liberties here. But her death in this play Alan had cobbled together from fact and fiction connects to her real death in Saga's campaign, which we'll see shortly. After touching the vinyl, Alan then has a conversation with Saga, but it leads nowhere. With his draft now complete, he enters Parliament Tower again. Here we see more parts of Alice's exhibit, before Alan makes it to the writer's room again. He enters the writer's room only to find the script for Return again. He learns that it's a horror story about how the Dark Presence is going to take over Bright Falls. Alan can't let that happen, so he starts to make edits to it. He changes the script to have Saga as the main character. This is when he would start writing Return, and when the effects of Return would start affecting Saga and her story. In Saga's campaign, we can find manuscript pages with multiple edits and scribbles. The original words are Scratch. The edits are Alan. Also, again, keep in mind that time flows very differently in the Dark Place. By the time Saga gets to Bright Falls, the story of Return has already begun, as Rose comments on Logan's death, even though in-game this would be hours before Alan rewrote the story here. Alan saw glimpses of the future, which were his conversations with Saga, and used that to rewrite the past. But right in the middle of changing the script, Alan is killed by Scratch again. Third time's the charm, as they say, so next draft. The same start as before. The echoes of Casey's investigation into the cult become the basis for the story. This time the plot was that Alex Casey had tracked the cult onto a movie theater where they began playing Thomas Zane's lost film Nightless Night. Things start blurring the lines between fact and fiction again, as Alex Casey finds himself as the lead in the movie despite never performing it, and the cult leader, the Grand Master, starts talking to Alan Wake directly. The plot of the film, Nightless Night, follows Alex Casey looking into the cult. He finds Alan Wake, who's played by Thomas Zane in the film, before disappearing. The film is really strange and jumps between different points in time, but Casey seems to be aware that he is in a story. He is then seen next to a broken well with his lover, Barbara Jagger. She seems to get him extremely drunk, before using him as a ritual sacrifice. This sacrifice then sees Thomas Zane, again playing the character of Alan Wake, rising from the well. Casey, despite dying, is seen observing this from afar, before being sent back to the writer's room again. Remember, this is meant to be a collaborative piece with Scratch's return, so this seems to imply that had this been successful, Casey, the real one, would have likely been killed so that Thomas Zane could escape, while Return would allow Scratch to as well. Which segues neatly into who Scratch is. See, right after this third draft is complete, Alan will once again go to Parliament Tower. Inside his apartment, he learns that Alice had killed herself because Scratch kept tormenting her. Overcome with rage, he bursts into the writer's room and shoots Scratch, before a moment of clarity hits him. He had seen all this before. Last loop, he was the victim. This loop, he's the murderer. Scratch isn't some different entity. He is Alan Wake when corrupted with the Dark Presence. So Scratch is not a different person, it's just Alan. So Alan's corrupted self was collaborating with Thomas Zane to escape. Scratch's failure to escape, though, could likely be because he forgot to write Initiation. As we discussed in American Nightmare, Initiation must come before Return. Alan Wake, when he was Scratch, might not have known this at the time, so his attempt to betray Thomas failed because the story wasn't good enough. But if Scratch is truly Alan but with the Dark Presence inside him, then that would call into question American Nightmare Scratch, as those two act independently from each other. My only theory is that Alan did defeat him at the end of American Nightmare, but because Scratch was gone, the Dark Presence needed a way to keep a leash on Alan. Scratch was most of Alan's worst qualities made manifest. Now the Dark Presence is just bringing out those terrible qualities while inside Alan this time. Back to the timeline of events though, as I said, Alice had killed herself because of Scratch. But because Alan is Scratch, that would mean it was Alan's fault. In both Control and Alan Wake 2, we know that Alice was setting up photos of Scratch to display in her exhibit. When we enter the apartment during Alan's campaign, we hear a camera shutter and Alice talking afterwards. These are glimpses into those moments. Maybe not the exact moments themselves, but a representation of what they looked like. Alan had done all this himself, even if he didn't realize it. Alan then rushes into the writer's room to shoot himself at a different point in time, believing this to be Scratch. I'll talk about more of this later, but Alan Wake 2 is set in a spiral. Alan is seeing or talking to himself at different points. Before entering the apartment, he gets a call from himself. This was Alan further ahead in the timeline. The Alan he shoots in the chair was the one earlier in the timeline. After this then, Alan Wake will then be taken over by the Dark Presence, but this was also right when he got shot out onto the shore, which explains why he was worried that Scratch got out. Since Scratch is Alan with the power of the Dark Presence inside him, technically he is correct, but at this point he is unaware that the two are just the same being. With that clearing up most of Alan's campaign, let's head to Saga's campaign next. When we last left off, she had just defeated Nightingale and found Alan Wake washed up on the shore. The three then head back to the lodge to get some answers. Saga then learns of the clicker and its power, and decides to head to the town of Watery as a manuscript page says that the cult has the clicker in its possession. Here she will run into the brothers Ilmo and Yako, who are starting to believe the story of Return. They were saddened to hear about Logan's passing, but glad that she came back to Watery. The powers of the manuscript are starting to possess more people, which means the story of Logan drowning will eventually come true if Saga doesn't figure out how to stop this. While in Watery, she stops by an old home in a trailer park, the one everyone believes is hers. Here she meets with the Anderson brothers, who greet her like family. Because she is. Saga's last name is an Anderson for no reason. Tor and Odin are her grandpa and uncle respectively. Saga's real life is revealed throughout the game, but basically she was born to her mother Freya Anderson. Freya and her father Tor Anderson had a falling out over her husband. Tor and Odin claimed that he was bad news. They wanted him to leave their family alone, but he refused. This is one of the few events that caused Freya to abandon the family and raise Saga alone with her husband. I mentioned back in Alan Wake 1 that the Andersons came from a long line of seers. This involves Saga too, but she was never told about this power until this moment. Saga has this thing called a mind place. Mechanically, it allows you to keep track of the cases you build throughout the game. Similar to how Alan thought the echoes of Alex Casey were old ideas of his, Saga just assumed this mind place was her intuition. Tor and Odin revealed that it's a real place and it has real powers. This is hinted at numerous times throughout the game, as Saga can profile people in her mind place and always puts together the facts even without evidence. Like her relative, she could find the truth within the lies. That's why she can remember Logan's real fate. Had she not been an Anderson, she would have gone along with the story of Return and thought that her daughter died. Speaking of family lineage, the only one who is not mentioned is her father. It's heavily implied that her father is Warland Dorr. Mr. Dorr is the talk show host Alan will meet during his campaign. He puts on some spectacular performances, including a whole musical. The third time around though, it's revealed that Mr. Dorr only did this to indulge Alan. He was just playing around before, but now, it's serious. He warns Alan of their next encounter, scolding him for getting the people he cares about wrapped up in his story. This seems to be referring to Saga, as she was brought into the story thanks to Alan. Mr. Dorr is also seen in a small conflict with a character named Tim Breaker. Tim Breaker was, at the time, the current sheriff of Bright Falls, until he mysteriously disappeared early on in the game. As Alan, you could find him in the dark place trying to piece together the mystery of Mr. Dorr. Behind him is a whiteboard of all of his notes and thoughts on Mr. Dorr, but they haven't led to a proper conclusion yet. Their conflict seems to be an early showing of the game's connected multiverse. We'll see this expanded on in the first DLC, but Tim Breaker mentions how he sees different realities of himself. The constant variable, though, is Mr. Dorr, who seems to be dead set on killing him in each reality. He still can't make heads or tails of the thing though, hinting that this will be expanded upon in future entries. And speaking of mysterious characters, no other rises to that level of mystery as Ahti. Admittedly, I had no idea where to throw Ahti into this script because he's such an enigmatic character, it was hard to figure out where to break pace and talk about him. Ahti first appeared to Control as the oldest house's janitor. He would also serve as a guide, helping Jessie navigate her way through the building. He serves the same role here in Alan Wake 2, helping Saga and Alan find their way. Outside of this, Ahti's existence and motivations are entirely unknown. Remedy Entertainment is notably from Finland, and Ahti is a character from Finnish mythology, said to be a sea god. But we know just as much about him now as we did back in Control. In fact, we might even know less about him now. Point being, both these entities seem to represent teases of events soon to come, so it'll be something to keep an eye on for the future. Returning to the story, having learned that she's a seer, Saga is told by Tor and Odin to stop all this before it turns real, and the story of Return changes reality. This is when she'll run into Mulligan and Thornton. According to some manuscripts, both deputies have found a Taken stumbling out from the dark. They immediately got up and shot it, only to realize it was just a town resident named Monica. The two decided to never speak of this again and dumped her body in the well. The guilt that came from taking her life ate away at the deputies though, and coupled with their resentment of Saga for getting in the town's business was enough for the darkness to turn them into Taken. Saga then assembles a parade float, which lets her enter the nearby overlap, resulting in the deaths of Thornton and Mulligan. With the clicker in hand, Saga then heads back to the lodge. While on the way back, the place is ambushed by the Cult of the Tree. See, the Cult of the Tree, as we'll learn, are actually the good guys. They were created back in 2013, a few years after the disappearances started happening in 2010, the time of Alan Wake 1. They knew about the powers of the lake and knew about Alan Wake, so people from Bright Falls and the nearby town of Watery formed a neighborhood watch of sorts to protect the towns. There used to be a group called the Torchbearers who handled this, but because many of its members left or were too old, the leaders of this new cult, Ilmo and Yako, felt that a new group needed to take up the mantle. The Cult of the Tree had managed to find the clicker, the same one Alan used against the Dark Presence, and had used his methods to defeat the Taken. Nightingale and all the other people who went missing became Taken. As we know from Control, the FBC had set up operations here to study the lake and its reality-changing powers. Well, a report came in from the FBC that someone seems to be hijacking their signals. The Cult of the Tree were the ones hijacking it. They didn't trust this mysterious government entity to handle things, so they would wait until they got a signal and then round up the gang and wait in the woods until the Taken appeared. The cult would then carve out the heart of the Taken they found, and then use the clicker inside its chest to expunge the evil from it, just like Alan did to the Dark Presence 13 years ago. But they needed this to be done in secret, which is why the urban legend of the cult was spread. As Ilmo says himself, what kind of cult calls themselves a cult? They did it to scare the townspeople so they could operate in peace. But two bloggers, Eddie and Tammy Booker, were getting a story for Tammy's book. They wanted to write about the disappearance of Alan Wake, so they snuck into the forest at night but ended up stumbling upon the cult's ritual. This forced them to leave the ritual unfinished, and because Nightingale wasn't killed properly, he was able to awaken back at the morgue. The reason they're trying to kill Alan Wake is because he's the cause of this. He knows that Alan's writings caused the attacks in 2010, so as long as he lives, more people will die. This is, to be fair, sound reasoning, all things considered. Recall how Alan had written Saga and her family into the story despite them being innocent bystanders. Whether through a lack of morality or desperation, or both, caused by Alan being trapped here for 13 years, Alan's stories were getting darker, and he cared less and less about who was involved and how. So the cult is here to kill Alan Wake, but Casey can't let that happen, so he defends himself. All while Alan starts getting a headache as he senses Scratch nearby. With that twist already revealed though, it makes sense why Alan wakes up caked in blood. The power of the Dark Presence still resides in him, it's just lying dormant. Once his power came out, it turned him into Scratch, and he likely killed all these people. As Alan tries to find Casey, he feels the power coming back again. One of the cultists manages to pin Alan down before Saga stops him. The cultist's mask comes off and it's revealed to be Ilmo. As if things couldn't get weirder, the FBC arrived just in time to take over the case. Agent Estevez has returned, arrests the two cult brothers and Alan, and tells Saga that this case is FBC business now. Saga can't accept that though because her family's life is in danger, so she has to do something even if it means going against the FBC. She plans to visit Tor and Odin so she could get some help. Something happened before her arrival though. Our previous Lady of the Light, Cynthia Weaver, had started becoming corrupted by the darkness. Alan uses this lamp in his campaign, which allows him to transfer light. It's mainly used for the sake of puzzles, but it's explained that this lamp was attached to the clicker. This lamp belonged to Cynthia Weaver though, and as we know from the first game, she never goes anywhere without her light. On top of this, age was getting to her. She wasn't as spry as she used to be, so she was neglecting her past duties of changing light bulbs. This meant that one of them did burn out, which allowed the Dark Presence to sneak into her bathroom and drown her. Now a Taken, she would then attempt to corrupt Tor Anderson by suckering up to him, hoping he would notice her advances. This, unfortunately, worked flawlessly, as Tor could be seen entering the overlap in search of her. So not only does Saga have to stop Cynthia, but also save Tor in the process. To help her, she requests that Rose explain what's going on. Rose refuses to elaborate though, as she isn't allowed to. That's when Saga tells her the secret passphrase, Wake has returned. Rose, like Cynthia before her, was told to spread out supplies and weapons for the hero of the story. She was also the one who stole Cynthia's lamp and put it in the shoebox for Alan. Saga was that hero, although it's not clear who told her to do this. Rose claims it's Alan, but Alan himself will comment that he never reached out to her. My current theory is that either Alan did, but unknowingly, it has been 13 years after all. Rose did it herself, as due to being corrupted in the first game, she's possibly more in tune with the dark place than it may seem and may have sensed Alan's struggles. Or our secret admirer is Alice, which will make a bit more sense when we get to the end of the game. Still, Rose's role, however she got it, was clear, and now that she's met Saga, the hero, she can now help her in any way that she could. Through her help, Saga enters the overlap using that vinyl record. This was a song Tor made as an apology to Freya after the fight the two had, which caused Freya to abandon the family. This opens up the overlap, giving Saga the chance to kill Cynthia and rescue Tor. Once she succeeds, she talks to Tor, who tells her that while she can use the clicker, Alan has to be the one to rewrite the story. so the two are going to have to work together. Saga then travels to the sheriff's station where the FBC is held up and is about to give Alan the clicker, only for her and everyone else to learn that Alan is Scratch. The power of the Dark Presence took him over once more, as the clicker was Scratch's goal all along. The clicker will let Scratch enact its end goal, so Saga has to stop him. Using some FBC equipment, she could force Scratch into a retreat, giving them enough time to think over what just happened. Now we've officially hit the endgame, the point of no return. The plan is simple. They're going to get Alan out of the dark place by performing a concert and then using the clicker to shoot him out. See, despite what we've discussed, at this point in the game they believe that Scratch and Alan are two separate people. Saga and everyone else believes that the being they found on the shore that day was Scratch, disguised as Alan. That's not true, of course, but that's what they believe at this moment. So with the help of the Anderson brothers, they perform the concert, and nothing happens. Again, Scratch and Alan aren't two separate beings. They can't walk around independently from each other. So there never was any Alan to take out of the dark place. At this point in time, anyway. See, this concert has created some kind of loop, where Saga's use of the clicker sends Alan out of the dark place, only for him to arrive at the shore in Chapter 2. Only for Saga to then go through the same story and end up here in Chapter 7, perform the concert, use the clicker, and send Alan out of the dark place, only to arrive back on the shore in Chapter 2 again. Since this doesn't affect present-day Alan, this is when Alan arrives then still as Scratch, forcing Saga to trap him inside the FBC containment cell. Scratch was able to break through though, and not only transfer his essence to Casey's body, but also toss Saga into the dark place. With the clicker in hand, Scratch's wish for the world will soon come true. Tor and Odin also go into Cauldron Lake to rescue Saga, so it's up to Alan to figure this out. Fortunately, the clicker left behind some kind of overlap in the road. So, despite escaping after 13 years, Alan makes the daring choice to go back, even if it means possibly resulting in another 13-year imprisonment. What he arrives at is an eternal deer fest. He needs to run through the crowd and get to the writer's room to fix return, before Scratch comes by and kills him. But when he gets there though, he's stuck. He doesn't know what to write for the ending. He'll need Saga's help to understand what to do. While this is happening, Saga is going through what Alan went through in the DLCs. Since it's her first time, she's stuck trying to wrestle with her emotions and feelings. Once she gets her head on straight, she ends up in Alan's dark place. Here she gets a call from Alice, who tells her to get the items from the shoebox. Early on in Alan's campaign, he was given 2 photos, a bullet of light and the clicker. He then put these in the shoebox right outside Parliament Tower. Alice then tells Saga to grab these items and use them, because Alice isn't actually dead. After the events of the first game, Alice struggled immensely. She couldn't cope with the loss of Alan, and the fact that he was showing up to her house nightly wasn't helping either. She decided that it would be therapeutic to capture these moments and display them in an exhibit. She even put together a documentary to explain her creative process, but the final shot ends with her taking her life. However, where she fell was a cliff near Bright Falls. That lake is Cauldron Lake. She jumped into the dark place. Alice already knew that Alan wasn't dead, she just needed to figure out how to get him out of there. That's why I think Alice is a possible candidate for Rose's admirer. She could have been telling her to set up things for Saga, so that Saga could get here and do what Alice wanted her to do. This then brings us to the final scene, the finale of the game, and the ending of Return. Saga enters the writer's room. Scratch, still possessing Casey, also enters. She uses the clicker on Scratch. Scratch leaves Casey and goes into Alan. She then uses the bolt of light and shoots Alan, removing Scratch from everyone. As the game ends, Saga calls Logan to see if she answers. If she does, then Return's reality is removed, but we see nothing as the screen goes black, leaving her fate ambiguous. Alan then wakes up and says it's not a loop, it's a spiral. The concept of a spiral was hinted as far back as Control. Alan, despite what he thinks, is not actually in a loop, he's in a spiral. Literally. A circular loop would imply that you're going through the same exact events over and over again. Both American Nightmare and Alan Wake 2 have shown us, though, that this is simply not true. The broad strokes are the same, similar murders, murder scenes, and same visit to Parliament Tower, but it's not the same exact ones as before. One time the murder was in a subway, the other in a hotel. In one, Alan was shot while making edits. Another time he shot the Alan making edits. If this was truly a loop, he would be doing the same exact tasks, no different than restarting and clicking New Game from the main menu. But since they are different, that means he's making progress. Slow progress, most likely, but progress nonetheless. Which brings us to the final draft. A couple of months after release, Alan Wake 2 received a free update adding a new Game Plus mode called the Final Draft. This is a direct continuation of the story. Just like repeat visits in the Dark Place rewarded Alan with more knowledge of escape, the Final Draft acts as another. It's a new Game Plus creatively disguised as an in-universe redraft. As such, we'll have to go through the game again, but to further reinforce that we are moving deeper into the spiral, while the basic structure has stayed the same, some details have changed. Most of these changes from here on come in the form of manuscript pages, which point towards this deja vu we found ourselves in. Other than that, there are a couple of new scenes. One stars Dr. Darling, who was a scientist in control. However, he had mysteriously gone missing before the events of the game, and no one knew where he went. Well, he seems to have found his way into the dark place somehow. Oh, but don't worry, he seems to be collaborating with Thomas Zane. That is a pretty peculiar detail though, as during the base game when talking with Thomas Zane, the TV will turn on, showing Dr. Darling and Jesse from control, which prompts Tom to hide, claiming that they're watching him. So, who knows where this newfound partnership will go. The other is a conversation with Tor and Odin at the end of the game. It was quite weird that they just walked into the lake and then were never heard from again. This conversation all but confirms that Mr. Door is Saga's dad, and also seems to claim that they have buried the hatchet and are no longer enemies. Or, at least Odin buried the hatchet. Tor hasn't yet. Either way, it sounds like great news. Hopefully him and Tim can now figure things out before they cause more problems for the world. And then finally, we have the ending cutscene. It's the same as before, except an addendum at the end, which shows Logan picking up the phone. She's alright. Return's original ending never came true. As for Alan, he not only wakes up and says that Scratch is officially gone, but he has some ending narration for this specifically. He has a line that says, quote, "When the bullet of light blew the darkness out of the crater of my skull, the dark presence was born from the remains, feeding on the horror around it to grow." I've seen some over the past year interpret this as Alan giving the dark presence an origins that he could destroy it. The dark presence is unknowable and incomprehensible, so by giving it an origin, it can somehow be harmed directly. This means that the dark presence was born from this moment, who would then infest the dark place, battle with Zane, the Anderson brothers, and Alan, only to arrive back here and die via the bullet of light, resetting the loop. I've also heard some say that this is impossible, and Alan and Saga just simply defeated the dark presence and nothing more. To add to some of the confusion though, Alan ends the game by saying that he's become the master of many worlds. I assume this means he has powers similar to that of Mr. Door, possibly implying that like Door, he is no longer bound by the rules of the Dark Place, and can go to and from as he pleases. All of this will likely be ironed out in a sequel though. For what it's worth, it does at least seem to be a good ending. When Alice recorded her message to Alan, she mentioned how he will either end in destruction or ascension. This seems to be the first step towards that ascension. So all things considered, it seems as though Alan has actually succeeded, and the hero's journey is finally complete. But while that may be the ending of the base game, we still have some DLC to clean up before we head out. The first of which is called Night Springs, a 3-part episodic journey where we play as various characters from across the games, such as Rose, Jesse Faden, and Tim Breaker. Having said that, these are not the exact same characters that we meet in the base game. Tim Breaker is not Tim, but now Sean Ashmore, and there are reasons for this. See, these episodes take place before Alan Wake 2. They are, in some ways, a continuation of American Nightmare, where Alan had repurposed ideas into a Night Springs episode. The first has Rose, known as the #1 fan, doing everything in her power to rescue her writer, who is Alan. Along the way, she's stopped by the Alpha Wolf himself, the bad boy, played by Scratch. The second DLC is Jesse Faden playing the sibling, trying to rescue her sibling from a government facility at Coffee World. Joining her is Polaris and the Sheriff. The Sheriff here believes that this is all a big government experiment. He claims that the deep state is putting things in the coffee to turn people into coffee monsters, even suggesting that these shadowy cabal types are brainwashing people. By the end, we learn that the coffee really is actually infecting people, and that her sibling is Alan Wake. The final DLC has to do with Tim Breaker, now known as the Actor. He's playing the actor in a role before being thrown into the role that he was just acting in. His character is a multiversal agent whose job is to stop the master of many worlds, Mr. Door. But later he then becomes that character who has to take down Mr. Door. He then meets the red-haired woman who teaches him how to harness the powers of multiverse travel. This sees him jumping into multiple realities, even going to the end of the multiverse itself, only to find Alan in the writer's room. So, yeah, Alan's gone a little bit insane, right? I think this was established pretty early on in that Rose episode. Do keep in mind again that these are not the same characters that we know. This is not Rose, not the one we're familiar with. Similar to the echoes left behind by Alex Casey, he seems to be able to peer into other realities, and use these as the building blocks for his story. Just like Casey's echoes though, it's only part of the story. Alan has to take some creative liberties to fill in the rest. Jesse Faden's episode as the sibling mimics the same plot beat that the real Jesse Faden went through in Control. Jesse had been trying to find the FBC for years, as they were the ones who took her brother Dylan. The sibling is looking for her brother, as a government agency of unknown origin also took her brother from her. and Tim Breaker's is about as close as Remedy could get to using Quantum Break without getting a copyright lawsuit. Tim Breaker's conflict with Mr. Door has many similarities to Jack Joyce and Mr. Hatch. It's a bit meta since the actor and director are not only played by Shawn Ashmore and Sam Lake respectively, but that's what the actor and director's actual names are in this episode. The two of them talk about a Timebreaker video game about a multiversal agent who fights Mr. Door, the master of many worlds. It's also going to use FMV cutscenes, just like the last game they made, once again referring to Quantum Break and the conflict between Jack and Hatch. Timebreaker also references the different realities and the people within those realities, such as this example where one person may have died in an explosion, another may have gained supernatural powers, and another has an alien guardian. Each refers to Beth Wilder, Jesse Faden, and the sibling respectively, all of whom are played by actress Courtney Hope. Our actor also has his own set of realities. There's Shawn Ashmore, not just this actor but the real Shawn Ashmore for to get meta about it, Tim Breaker from the base game, Branch, another version of the actor in an alternate reality, and Jack Joyce from Quantum Break. Remedy has always wanted to add Quantum Break to the Remedy Connected universe, but because of copyright they don't own the property. Same reason why Max Payne can't be included, even if they have multiple stand-ins for him. Out of all the episodes, this final one seems to carry the most significance. According to Tim Breaker in the base game, Mr. Door was spotted near Cauldron Lake before being struck by lightning, which may have given him his supernatural powers, as now he could travel to all the realities as he's opened the door to all of them. He seems to have a specific hatred towards Shawn Ashmore, or whatever character he ends up playing in whatever reality. In the end though, instead of finding Mr. Door, our actor finds the master of many worlds, Alan Wake, a reference to that last scene in the final draft. While at the moment these serve as failed attempts by Alan to escape the dark place, this last episode hinted a future conflict yet to come for the Connected universe. This is also the case for our last DLC, The Lake House. The Lake House stars Agent Kieran Estevez and explains how she got to Bright Falls and managed to find Alan in the forest during that shootout at the lodge. She initially came here because she received word of paranormal activity at Cauldron Lake. Not exactly surprising, they've received reports of activity in 1970, 76, 78, and 2010. Thomas Zane, the Anderson brothers, and Alan Wake. But what was strange was the lake house itself. The lake house is run by a married couple, Doctors Jules and Diana Marmont. It's clear from the audio logs and reports, however, that they aren't on good terms. They seem to be very driven as scientists, but also very competitive. Much of the lake house's current state could be attributed to their interpersonal conflict of being the better researcher. The main research going on in the lake house was to establish a connection between the Bright Falls threshold and the real world. As this is a research facility, multiple avenues of research are being tested simultaneously. The first was establishing what counts as art, since the dark place only responds to art forms. Things like painting, writing, and filmmaking are easy enough to understand, but things like interpretive dance and nursery rhymes seem to be effective as well. Another avenue they took was recreation. Alan Wake and his powers are well known amongst the staff. They also concluded that writing was the most effective art form. The words on the page are not subjects of interpretation. What happens on the page will happen, no way around it. So the research team attempted to recreate Alan's work. The automated typing device, or ADT, is an automatic typewriter that will write a manuscript page and then be graded based on its similarity to Alan Wake's writing. The pages need to match both his comprehension and vocabulary, as well as his style, like his use of metaphors. Those that are considered the highest grade, or those closest to Alan Wake's own writing, are then fed back into the algorithm so that the other machines can use it as a base. Eventually, over time, this will produce writing on par of Alan Wake himself, meaning this would allow them to write their own manuscripts and reshape their reality without needing someone like Alan to help them. Their other test was a live subject. They'd initially passed the idea of a live subject off to the FBC, but they were denied. However, after the facility went dark, which we saw during the events of Control, they determined that what the FBC doesn't know won't hurt them. So they hired artists from Bright Falls and Watery to help serve as test subjects. They recruited both the bookers from back in Saga's campaign, but the most important subject was Subject P, who happens to be Rudolph Lane. He was briefly seen at the lodge back in Alan Wake 1. After the lodge was attacked by the Dark Presence, the FBC managed to find Rudolph and bring him here for study. The Marmonts realized early on that observing an artist in action, rather than testing an algorithm, was the most effective means of testing, but even then they were only interested in the results. They made him create dozens of pieces, all to see what kind of emotions it could elicit. The Marmont had used these tests not just for the sake of research, but also to get a one-up on their spouse. One of Alan Wake's pages had appeared in the research facility that spelled doom for the facility should they continue their research. Jules had become worried. He didn't want to lose their beautiful building. Unlike Jules, Diana was a risk taker, so she kept pushing the experiments. This caused a few insults to be hurled and complaints to be issued, especially as news of them hiding research from the others started to spread across the facility. From the emails between the staff, it's clear that they were the headline of the weekly facility gossip. Everyone knew about their struggling relationship as it was affecting the research. But eventually their goal was achieved. They were able to open the threshold. But how will surprise you. This whole DLC is a commentary on the value of art. The ADTs were used to imitate Alan's writing, certainly a reference to the recent rise in AI art. And Rudolph was used to create art for the sake of experimentation and volume. His art was a task, a job. It's not evocative, it's not saying anything. Art isn't something that can just happen. It's the emotions and talents of the artist combined with their unique art form. The Marmonts see art as a tool, an experiment. It's why they're researchers and not artists. Alan put it well in a manuscript. The art was not art, just content for the experiment. The Marmonts see numbers and stats, where an artist would see emotion. This is explicitly seen in the amount of paintings Rudolph made and what was written down in the notes. All the researchers wrote down were descriptions, describing what was on the canvas, like colors and shapes, rather than interpreting what it means. They were so focused on the what when it should have been the why. This is ultimately why they failed. Art cannot be created through a process or an algorithm. Real art comes from emotion, which is why the one painting that did work came from the heart. Rudolph Lane's mental state was getting worse and worse as the days went on. He was just told to paint and was becoming burnt out as a result. The Marmonts then decided to change things around to see if outside stimuli could invoke different emotions. They wanted to create more negative emotions in him in hopes that it would result in some kind of unique data. Eventually, Lane snapped. He decided then and there to create one last painting, a self-portrait, to let the people of the lake house know what they did to him. The strokes of the piece were crude, violent, and angry, giving rise to the talking painting who talks to us throughout the game. Something I admittedly never thought about until this DLC brought it up was the interpretation of art. As I mentioned before, writing was effective when controlling the powers of the Dark Place, because it's easy to understand without much nuance involved. But what about more abstract concepts, things like paintings and dance? What does the Dark Place do to a piece that requires interpretation? Can the Dark Place even interpret art? Well, it seems as though it can, as it managed to take those spiteful, angry emotions he had when painting and use that as the basis for its design. The talking painting is angry, filled with the hatred of its owner. It was a piece created from emotion, enough emotion to bridge the gap between worlds. The threshold between the Dark Place and the real world was open, but the darkness soon followed. The facility staff became taken, and the self-portrait of Lane seems to have spread across the facility, not just corrupting it, but even manifesting beings based on its design. Naturally, this whole event is a major cause for concern, so Estevez plans to clean this up. To do this, she'll need to go down to the lower floors and shut off the experiment. She also takes down Diana and Jules, who have become taken, still holding a grudge against one another. Afterward, she apologizes to Lane for what she'll have to do, as it wasn't his fault that things turned out this way. She then shuts the machine down, possibly trapping the piece in the Dark Place, saving the facility. Following this, she's then transported into some kind of overlap, similar to what Saga was in when talking with Alan. Inside, she hears Alan writing his draft for return. This gives her a tip on his location, which is how she arrived to arrest him during the shootout, thus bringing an end to the DLC. Well, this part of the story at least. Just as AWE briefly set up Alan Wake 2, Lake House briefly sets up a possible Control sequel. When Estevez goes to floor 4, she's greeted by an empty room with a man in a box. Judging by the P6 on his shirt, it's pretty clear that this is Dylan Faden. Jessie Faden came to the FBC to find her brother, but while she found him, something was wrong. Dylan had undergone many experiments while here in the Bureau, and the Hiss entity was making things worse. He seemed different, possessed in some ways. Here in the lake house, Estevez can talk to him, but it seems to be a projection, as he claims that he is still back in the oldest house in New York. He then ends the conversation by asking Estevez to tell Jessie that he tried. He really did, before a slideshow of images appears. Going frame by frame, it seems like we have a new entity to deal with, possibly the mold. It also seems like the infestation is spreading outside the oldest house and onto the streets of New York. But we'll put a pin in this for now and circle back to this when Control 2 releases. Although teases of this could possibly be seen in Remedy's next release, FBC Firebreak. It seems to take place inside the FBC, where the Firebreak unit, the FBC's most adaptable unit, has to restore order to the Bureau. It seems to be said after or during Control, as there is a brief photo of Jessie as the director in the background. But that, as they say, will have to be for another time. As for right now, this marks the end of Alan Wake. Thank you all for watching today, and I hope you enjoyed. Huge shout out again to Remedy and Epic for sponsoring the video. That was very nice of them. Again, if you want to pick up the Alan Wake games, now's the time to do it, and do it fast, as you have until December 2nd or 3rd depending on the platform. If you enjoyed the video, then make sure to like and subscribe for more content like this. If you want to support the work I do, then feel free to donate to the Patreon for as little as $1 a month with the link in the description. Thank you to my returning viewers for coming back to another video, and take care everyone. Goodbye.